Welcome back to Biographics. I'm your host, cosmic horror author and storytelling madman Eric Malachite, and today's video was written by James CJ, so be sure to show him some love in the comments as you deploy your likes, subscribe to the channel and ring that bell if you haven't, and check out our new sister channel About Us, which talks about the history of businesses. If that sounds like something you'd be interested in, go ahead and click the link in the description or pinned comment and watch the videos we've already got up there for you. Let's get to it. Charles Bukowski lived for the majority of the 20th century, becoming the voice of ordinary Americans. He spoke to and about those who experienced poverty, hard work, little reward, unhealthy and frayed relationships, alcoholism, drug addiction, and other more seedy aspects of life, particularly in Los Angeles, California. He was a complicated man who wrote very personal stories and poems primarily through an alter ego named Henry Chinaski. From his earliest days all the way through to his death, Bukowski was a scarred man with demons far beyond his own control, and in turn, he was one of the best and perhaps most controversial American writers of the 20th century. He published 6 novels in his lifetime and a long list of poems, poetry collections, and short stories. It took a long time for him to gain fame and success, but he eventually found it. This is the tale of the dirty old man, the 10-year drunk, the laureate of American lowlife. On August 16, 1920, Heinrich Karl Bukowski was born in Andernach, Germany. His father, Heinrich Bukowski, was an American who remained in Germany following World War I, which he fought in the U.S. Army. Heinrich married Katarina Fett, a Polish-German, a month before Katarina gave birth to Charles, but struggled to make ends meet due to economic conditions in the nation following World War I. On April 18, 1923, the Bukowskis left Germany and sailed for Maryland, and by the early 1930s moved to Los Angeles, California. Unfortunately, the US didn't provide the kind of life Heinrich had hoped it would. Often unemployed, the family struggled both economically and emotionally. Charles suffered tremendously during this period as his father was physically and mentally abusive, finding even the smallest infraction as a reason to beat Charles. Beyond the cruelty of his father and his mother's inaction, Charles found life outside his home wasn't necessarily easier. He'd grown up a shy, socially withdrawn, and awkward kid. His classmates constantly ridiculed him due to his thick German accent, the clothing his parents made him wear, and his extreme acne during his teen years. While these years were far from easy on Bukowski, they were formative in helping shape his voice as a writer. From a young age, he'd taken many of these hardships and found a way to use them to fuel his passion for writing. He made comments on the abuse of his father, stating it helped him understand undeserved pain, and the Great Depression intensified his rage. One fateful day, when Charles was 13, a friend invited him to his father's wine cellar, and together the two drank wine, presumably getting a little tipsy. This was when Bukowski decided alcohol was going to be helpful to him for a long time, and he was right. After graduating from high school in 1939, Charles attended Los Angeles City College, taking courses in literature, journalism, and art. During this period, he wrote numerous pieces, but found nothing but rejection from the publishing world. In 1941, he quit university and moved to New York City, wanting to get a blue-collar job and become a writer. In July 1942, Bukowski was arrested by the FBI while he lived in Philadelphia not long after leaving New York. He was suspected of dodging the draft, and his German heritage didn't help him during a time when German Americans were considered disloyal simply for being German or having German ancestry. For 17 days, he was held in a prison in Philadelphia before he completed a psychological and physical exam. He failed the psychological test and was declared unfit for military service. The same year he'd been apprehended by the FBI and declared unfit to serve, Bukowski wrote a short story titled Aftermath of a Lengthy Rejection Slip, which was published in Story magazine. It was an early achievement that was followed up with another short called 20 Tanks from Castledown in 1946, published in issue 3 of Portfolio in Intercontinental Quarterly. Bukowski wasn't finding any true success and became almost bitter towards the publishing process, so in 1946 he quit. Sort of. His output was inconsistent at best. For 10 years, Bukowski diverted his attention from writing to various other means of earning an income. He lived in Los Angeles, working in a pickle factory, then left that position and took on numerous dead-end jobs throughout the years. In the 1950s, he spent 3 years as a letter carrier at the U.S. Postal Service in LA. He hadn't entirely given up writing, having published several pieces during the 10 years he'd quit, but he wasn't chasing success. Success wasn't necessarily chasing him either. But all these aforementioned details don't define this period. Instead, it's defined by a person, Jane Cooney Baker, the first woman Charles ever loved. Bukowski's experience with love was no less complicated than the rest of his life. Charles met Jane in 1947 when Bukowski was 27. She was 10 years his senior. Jane was a tragedy of a woman. Her ex-husband, Craig Baker, who divorced her not long before she met Charles, had died in a car crash, for which Jane blamed herself for reasons unknown. Additionally, her mother, Mary Cooney, died not long after Baker. She'd turned to alcohol, starting to drink heavily, and one night in a bar, she met Charles Bukowski. She'd moved to Southern California for a fresh start. Her children stayed with their grandparents, but she eventually lost contact with them. She was a troubled woman with a tragic past. Maybe that's why the two found themselves so connected from the moment they met. One of the many reasons why Charles loved Jane was because she was the first person who paid attention to me in my life, a quote from a biography about Bukowski. At some point in their relationship, they moved in together, but were eventually kicked out from their place due to the couple's excessive drinking, especially that of Jane, which resulted in numerous instances of property damage. This became a pattern throughout their relationship. Charles was a self-proclaimed lover of alcohol, but Jane made him seem sober. Their relationship was toxic, volatile, violent, and, in a sense, damaging to Bukowski. He'd write numerous pieces about his time with Jane. While his love for her was genuine, this period of his life had repercussions. In the spring of 1955, he was rushed to hospital after waking up with stabbing pains in his stomach and blood streaming from both ends. At the hospital, he was treated for a near-fatal ulcer. It was believed he wasn't going to make it, but he managed to pull through. This experience changed Charles and reignited his passion for writing. Without this horrific experience, Bukowski may never have written again, at least not properly. His relationship with Jane after the hospital was no better. He returned and found she'd spent most of their money and damaged the car by lending it to someone who had had an accident. As a result of his struggles, his writing became even more personal, with Charles often appearing as the protagonist of his own poems and stories in the form of his character Henry Chinaski. Eventually, Charles and Jane's relationship would come to an end in late 1955. The two would see each other on and off again for several years, but Bukowski mentioned in several pieces that she'd aged quickly due to her excessive lifestyle. When they were together following their breakup, it wasn't the same. The love no longer seemed to exist, at least not like before. In between all this chaos was a different relationship. Charles Bukowski, no longer with Jane, was far more productive in writing more than he ever had previously. It was at this time that a woman from Wheeler, Texas, working as an editor at Harlequin magazine, reached out asking for poems. He sent the woman, Barbara Fry, a lot of poems, thinking she was an old woman who'd hate his poetry. She was, in fact, 11 years younger than him and believed him to be a genius, publishing 40 of his poems. Charles and Barbara began communicating a fair deal during this period, even exchanging pictures. In one letter, Charles wrote while he'd been drunk, and he responded to Barbara's concerns that nobody would marry her due to a deformity she had by stating he'd marry her. While he totally forgot that he wrote that, she didn't. He committed himself to following through with his drunken promise, and so Barbara left Texas and came to Los Angeles on October 28, 1955. The next day, the two drove to Las Vegas to make their marriage official. By all accounts, there were positives to this marriage. Finally, Bukowski had more stability than he'd had with Jane, living in a home and not having his neighbors truly despise him or his partner. The more strange aspect of their relationship was their sex life, which was rather intense. Barbara was a nymphomaniac, and Bukowski mentioned on numerous occasions that the two would sleep together nearly 12 times a week. In their bedroom, the walls had shelves lined above the bed, and their activities always made the contents of those shelves fall onto Charles during intercourse, which delighted Barbara, who told him not to stop and refused to let him take the shelves down. He later used this story in his writing. There are many reasons why the pair's relationship deteriorated, partly because of how it started. Charles simply did not love his wife, not one day in their relationship. She wanted children and he didn't. She did eventually get pregnant, but had a miscarriage and blamed Charles as she believed it was excessive drinking that had caused his part in the pregnancy to become tainted. He agreed. Charles was crude, was an alcoholic by his own definition, disliked her family, was antisocial, and was possibly depressed at numerous points during his marriages, including his marriage to Jane, and even more so in the years that followed both. In December 1956, Charles's mother died of cancer of the womb. By March 18, 1958, Charles and Barbara had divorced. Barbara died while in Indiana a few years after their divorce. The cause of her death is unknown. On December 4, 1958, Charles's father, Henry, died of a heart attack. With this, Charles inherited his parents' home and his father's car. He sold everything and gave away the rest, wanting no part of his former world or that of his father's. For years following the deaths of his mother, first wife, and father, Charles saw Jane every now and then. Then, in 1962, on January 22nd, Jane died. The exact reason was unclear, but the most likely culprit was a decade spent excessively drinking. A relationship doomed from the start that defined his late 20s and early 30s was over with no chance of revival. Bukowski, despite the sordid history, was devastated by the loss. In his more reflective works, Charles concluded in his poem, "My first affair with that older woman, she brought me immense pain." Thus ended nearly a decade of strange and damaging relationships and tepid tragedies. Charles had not only lost his family, but also both people he'd had serious relationships with. The question was, what now? In the spring of 1963, Bukowski met poet Frances Elizabeth Dean. She became a fan of his work after a mutual friend shared some of his poems with her. She sent him a letter asking if he'd consider visiting, and so one night during his off period from work, he called her, and that same day, she made her way to East Hollywood from Orange County. They were two broken people. He was still recovering from Jane, and Frances was reinventing herself following her divorce, leaving behind her children with her ex-husband. They connected and began dating shortly after, with her moving closer. Her relationship with Bukowski proved fruitful for her creativity as much as it did for him, having stopped writing in her low moments. So she began writing again. 9 months into their relationship, Frances became pregnant. He still didn't want kids, but he knew that this changed things, so he offered to marry her, and they moved to a better place. On September 7th, 1964, Marina Louise Bukowski was born. While Charles loved his daughter, life at home became problematic, and he began a true breakdown of his relationship with Frances. Charles worked a lot, and Frances spent her time either with their daughter or with her church, poetry, or activist groups. In November of 1965, he suffered another hemorrhage and coughed up nearly a half pint of blood. He was descending into manic depression. He struggled with the small living space he shared with his girlfriend and child. He was exhausted, and a large part of that was his drinking. By the end of November 1965, Charles and Frances would amicably end their relationship. He remained a doting father and a reliable source of financial support. For all his flaws, fatherhood proved not to be one of them. Over the course of the 60s, numerous Bukowski poetry collections were published by E.V. Griffith, the editor of Hearst Press. This started with his wife, the painter, in June of 1960. They'd continue publishing Bukowski's poems all through the 1980s. He was also featured in The Outsider magazine, where 2 poems appeared, one in 1963 and the other in 1965. Starting in 1967, he began writing for the Los Angeles underground magazine Open City. His column Notes of a Dirty Old Man was published in the magazine for several years until 1969, when the magazine was shut down. So he moved briefly to the Los Angeles Free Press and the NOLA Press in New Orleans, which was an underground hippie paper. His most important relationship formed in the second half of the 60s with a man named John Martin. It was March 1966 when John Martin sought out Bukowski. Martin became a fan when he came across two of Bukowski's poems in the Outsider magazine, and so he looked for others to publish as he was starting a press of his own. Black Sparrow Press would become one of the most important publications for poetry in America, and Bukowski was its first published poet. Black Sparrow became Bukowski's full-time publisher for the remainder of his career, even after his death. Bukowski found the publisher of any author's dreams in John Martin, who ensured Bukowski had what he needed to keep writing prolifically, like a typewriter, stamps to mail his poems out, and even financial support. Eventually, Charles left his job at the post office in 1969 at the age of 49 to become a full-time writer. A month after leaving, he wrote his first novel, Post Office, which was a semi-autobiographical book following Henry Chinaski, who survives on booze and women, is cynical and humorous, and works as a mail clerk. He was slowly starting to find success as a writer. For many years, Bukowski found himself in numerous romantic entanglements and one-night stands. Fast forward to September 29, 1976, Charles met Linda Lee Bailey. The timing of their meeting couldn't have been better. Charles was living in a sketchy neighborhood that was growing more violent by the day, and he was looking for a way out. He met Linda at the Troubadour on Santa Monica Boulevard, where he did a reading. She was a fan of his work, as they almost always are, and had read almost all his published works and been to any reading he'd done. This wasn't history repeating itself, though. Linda wasn't Jane, an abusive drunk. She wasn't Barbara, a woman he never loved. And she wasn't Frances, a woman he inevitably was stuck with because she fell pregnant. Linda was the real deal. She met Charles when he was broke, living in a hole, and still in the throes of one-night stands. What made her stick around is a mystery, but she did, and Bukowski was better off for it. Linda managed to get Charles to focus more on improving his dire health situation. He cut out hard liquor and began drinking wine. She stopped him from eating red meat and had him taking 35 vitamins a day. Some might say this is micromanaging a person, but in Charles's case, it was life-saving. He lost weight, and he felt and looked healthier. She was not a miracle worker, though. Charles was still a drunk, both in public and private, but it was still an improvement. Their relationship progressed slowly for the most part. She was celibate, which caused Charles to continue seeing other women, but over time he began craving her calm demeanor, her intelligence, and her supportiveness. After a trip to Germany in early 1978, they returned in November and moved together to San Pedro. Charles finally found success in his writing, earning a substantial income primarily thanks to sales in Europe. He was earning enough money that his tax accountant was advising him to start spending more on tax deductibles, like a new car, office equipment, an electric typewriter, and a house. They bought a house on the east side of the Palos Verde Peninsula, overlooking LA Harbor. By all measures, Bukowski late in life found success and stability, but his demons would rear their ugly heads yet again. In the later years of his career, Bukowski experienced tremendous success. He was getting offers for the film rights of numerous works of his. He was contracted to write a screenplay called Barfly, which he completed in October 1979. Life continued. He continued writing and making appearances, his drinking never ceased, and he remained a fixture at the horse tracks even though he didn't enjoy them. But he found them creatively beneficial for some reason. His relationship with Linda began faltering at times due to his drinking, but they always seemed to rebound. The unfortunate truth was, Bukowski had become like his father. He'd become abusive. He often went off at Linda for numerous things he believed were wrong, and this was partly due to his sometimes sexist views long ingrained in him. And in some instances, he even became violent. He constantly embarrassed Linda, but she stayed for years before leaving in September 1982. They'd continue seeing each other numerous times a week. Charles went back to sleeping around, Linda avoided him, and for the majority of 1983, they were apart except when she'd check on him, worried for his health and knowing that if she didn't see him, he'd see nobody but the girls he occasionally slept with. Despite their ongoing issues, by the end of 1983, he proposed to her. He was 64 and she was 41. By August 18, 1985, the two were married. To say they were explicitly happy together would be dishonest. They loved each other, there's no doubt about that. but their relationship was far from easy and the furthest thing from perfect. With Barfly on the verge of being made in 1987, Bukowski wanted Sean Penn in the lead role. But when Penn would only do the movie if Dennis Hopper directed it, the deal ultimately fell through. Despite this, the two remained good friends for the remainder of Bukowski's life. The whole experience in the movie put a bitter taste in his mouth about Hollywood, which he later wrote about in his book Hollywood. Despite the movie making him a true celebrity, Charles didn't embrace it, rejecting numerous interview offers except one from his friend Sean Penn for People magazine. After completing Hollywood, Bukowski's health took a downward spiral. Doctors were unable to understand what was wrong with him. He was losing weight at a tremendous rate, going from 217 to 175 pounds, before eventually dropping to 133 pounds by late April 1989. He wasn't able to type and instead wrote by hand in bed. Eventually, after 6 months of battling this unknown debilitating illness, Bukowski had a chest x-ray, which revealed a shadow on his lungs. He had tuberculosis, and for 6 months he was on antibiotics. He was forced to stop drinking, and slowly he began gaining weight and feeling better, but he was still unable to write. After 6 months of recovery, his health was slowly improving, and so he was able to start writing again, even if he wasn't as fast as before. 9 months later, he was able to live a normal life again, drinking, smoking cigars, and going places like the track. Despite being able to drink, there was a noticeable difference in the quantity he drank, which had severely decreased post-health scare. For Christmas 1990, Linda and his daughter Marina bought him a Macintosh 2 SI, and Charles went to a course to learn how to use it. This provided him some enjoyment as he began using it for his writing, eventually doubling his output of poems. In 1991, Charles began working on his last novel, Pulp. It was a challenging book for him to write as he contended with accidentally deleting chapters and then restarting the whole book, endless reworking and rewriting. But by the start of 1994, the book was completed. During this time, his health problems persisted. A cataract operation on his right eye, infections, cases of flu, alcohol-induced accidents, and finally in 1993, he was diagnosed with leukemia. Pulp would be released in May, but Charles wasn't around to witness it. Charles Bukowski's story ends at the age of 73 when he died on March 9th, 1994 of leukemia. As per his request, he wasn't buried with his family in Altadena, but instead in his own plot overlooking San Pedro, his adopted home. Buddhist monks conducted the ceremony as Bukowski had become interested in the religion towards the end of his life. In attendance were his wife Linda, his daughter Marina, Sean Penn, his publisher John Martin, and other friends, neighbors, and colleagues. Bukowski's legacy isn't an easy one to pin down. As a writer, he was prolific, often depicting the depravity of urban life and oppressed people in American society. Critics throughout his career often found his work and style offensive and sexist, yet truthful and containing an attitude of nothing to lose. That's translated to the present, with many viewing his work as problematic in a 21st century world. Despite this, he's still an artist worth exploring. He captured the times with excruciating honesty and didn't shy away from what he likely knew were problematic opinions. In his career, Charles Bukowski wrote more than 40 books, including poetry, prose, and novels. His books often contain sex, violence, gambling, music, alcohol, death, and commentary on the absurdities of life as Bukowski saw it. He often referred to his readership as the defeated, the demented, and the damned. His writing was often autobiographical, even if it was fictionalized or hidden behind a character. Due to his prolific nature, many poems were still published many years after his death. His work outlived him, and it's hard to imagine he'd have it any other way. I hope you learned something today, and if you dug today's video, be sure to deploy your likes, comment a famous person you'd like us to cover, subscribe to the channel and ring that bell, check out About Us by clicking that link in the pinned comment, and share this video with someone who loves learning about the people who made history happen. I'm Eric Malachite, and we'll see you next time.